I know it's there. I've got to believe it because I see the reactions, I see the photographs, I see the critics and people who recognize it in the street.
Audrey Hepburn spent her entire life being described as graceful, elegant, and untouchable. To the public, she seemed almost unreal, the woman in the black dress from Breakfast at Tiffany's, the princess from Roman Holiday, the face that defined Hollywood sophistication for an entire generation. But behind that image was someone far more complicated. Audrey carried heartbreak quietly. She carried abandonment quietly. And in the final years of her life, when interviews became more reflective and fame mattered less to her than truth, she admitted something deeply personal. The one man she never truly got over was not one of her husbands, not a famous co-star, and not the great love story Hollywood imagined for her. It was the first man who broke her heart, her father. That revelation changes the way her entire life looks in retrospect. Suddenly, the relationships, the sacrifices, the choices, and even her humanitarian work begin to form a different pattern. Audrey Hepburn was not simply searching for romance. She was searching for safety, stability, and the feeling of being loved unconditionally, something she lost when she was still a little girl. Before the glamour, before the awards, before the iconic gowns designed by Hubert de Givenchy, Audrey was a frightened child growing up in a Europe moving toward war. She was born in Brussels in 1929 to a wealthy but emotionally unstable family. Her father, Joseph Victor Anthony Rustin, was charming, intelligent, and deeply political. For a time, Audrey adored him completely. He was the center of her world. But beneath the polished surface of their upper-class life, the marriage between her parents was deteriorating quickly. Then came the moment that defined everything that followed. When Audrey was 6 years old, her father walked out of the family without warning. He left her mother behind. More importantly, he left Audrey behind. For most people, abandonment is painful. For Audrey, it became permanent emotional architecture. Years later, she would openly describe that experience as the greatest trauma of her life. She remembered waiting for him during school holidays, believing he might come see her. He never did. That kind of wound changes people forever, especially children. It teaches them that love can disappear without explanation. It teaches them to fear rejection even when they appear confident on the outside. Audrey learned those lessons early, and they quietly shaped nearly every relationship she entered afterward. As Europe descended into World War II, Audrey's childhood became even darker. After moving to the Netherlands, her family found themselves trapped under Nazi occupation. Food disappeared. Fear became normal. Audrey witnessed executions, raids, and starvation. During the terrible Dutch famine of 1944, she survived on tulip bulbs and whatever scraps could be found. Malnutrition permanently damaged her health. The thin frame the world later called elegant was, in part, the result of wartime starvation. But even during those horrific years, Audrey showed unusual courage. She helped the Dutch resistance by carrying secret messages and performing ballet recitals to raise funds for anti-Nazi efforts. The audiences could not applaud because applause might attract soldiers. Imagine that for a moment, a young girl dancing in silence while war raged outside. Those wartime experiences never left her. Neither did the memory of the humanitarian aid workers who brought food and medical supplies after liberation. Decades later, when she became a UNICEF ambassador, she often said she understood suffering because she had lived through it herself. When the war ended, Audrey pursued ballet. Seriously, hoping it would become her career. But years of malnutrition had weakened her body too much for elite professional dancing. Slowly, she shifted toward acting and modeling. What followed became one of the most remarkable rises in Hollywood history. Her breakthrough came with Roman Holiday opposite Gregory Peck. At the time, she was largely unknown. But the moment audiences saw her, everything changed. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress almost instantly. Hollywood had discovered someone completely different from the glamorous bombshells dominating the era. Audrey was delicate without seeming weak, sophisticated without seeming distant, and beautiful in a way that felt natural rather than manufactured. Yet even as the world fell in love with her, Audrey herself remained deeply insecure. Friends later said she often seemed surprised by her own fame. She never entirely believed she deserved the attention. Part of that insecurity traced back to her father leaving. When the person you love first decides you are not worth staying for, self-doubt tends to linger forever. That emotional vulnerability became especially visible in her romantic life. One of the earliest great loves of Audrey's life was William Holden, her co-star in Sabrina. Their chemistry was immediate and intense. Unlike many Hollywood romances invented by studio publicity departments, this relationship was very real. Crew members noticed it immediately. Holden was captivated by her warmth and vulnerability, while Audrey admired his confidence and charisma. For a brief period, she believed she had found lasting happiness. Holden even proposed marriage. But there was one devastating problem. Audrey desperately wanted children, while Holden had secretly undergone a vasectomy years earlier. When she discovered this, the relationship collapsed emotionally. She cared deeply for him, but motherhood mattered too much to compromise. That decision revealed something important about Audrey. Despite all the fame surrounding her, what she truly wanted most was not Hollywood success. It was family, stability, home. The things she never fully had growing up. Soon afterward, she married Mel Ferrer in 1954. On the surface, they appeared perfect together. Cultured, artistic, sophisticated. Ferrer helped guide aspects of her career, and Audrey initially appreciated his experience. But over time, the relationship became increasingly controlling. Friends noticed that Ferrer often dominated conversations and decisions. Audrey, despite being one of the most famous women in the world, frequently deferred to him completely. The imbalance grew stronger as her fame surpassed his own. Rumors of jealousy began circulating throughout Hollywood. At the same time, Audrey endured heartbreaking personal losses. She suffered multiple miscarriages during the marriage, including one after a serious accident while filming The Unforgiven. Those losses devastated her. Emotionally, she longed to become a mother so intensely that each miscarriage felt catastrophic. Finally, in 1960, she gave birth to her first son, Sean Ferrer. Audrey immediately shifted her priorities away from Hollywood. At the height of her fame, she voluntarily stepped back from acting to focus on motherhood. Studios could not understand it. Audiences adored her. She could have dominated cinema for decades uninterrupted. But Audrey cared more about creating a loving home for her son than maintaining celebrity status. Unfortunately, the marriage itself continued deteriorating. Reports of affairs, emotional tension, and resentment surrounded the couple for years. Eventually, after 14 difficult years together, the relationship ended in divorce. Audrey emerged from the marriage emotionally exhausted. Yet she still believed she could find the peaceful family life she wanted. Then came Andrea Detti. She met Detti during a Mediterranean cruise in the late 1960s. He was charming, intelligent, and socially magnetic. After the heaviness of her marriage to Ferrer, Detti felt exciting and carefree. Within months, they married, and Audrey moved to Rome hoping for a quieter existence away from Hollywood pressure. At first, the new life seemed idyllic. They had a son together, Luca Detti, and Audrey embraced domestic life fully. But behind the scenes, the marriage quickly became painful. Detti repeatedly cheated on her, often openly enough for tabloids to report on it constantly. Audrey found herself humiliated publicly despite trying desperately to protect her private life. Once again, she stayed longer than many expected. Friends believed part of the reason was her determination to keep another family together for the sake of her children. She did not want her sons to experience the instability she had experienced growing up. But eventually the marriage collapsed completely. 2 marriages. 2 deeply painful disappointments. And underneath both relationships was the same emotional pattern. Audrey continually choosing men who made her feel uncertain, men whose love seemed conditional or unstable. Psychologists and biographers later connected this directly to her father's abandonment. She spent her life trying to heal a wound created in childhood. One of the most revealing chapters of Audrey's life came when she finally located her father decades after he disappeared. Using Red Cross assistance, she tracked him down living quietly in Ireland. 4 years, she had imagined what this reunion might feel like. Perhaps he would apologize. Perhaps he would finally explain why he left. Perhaps he would express regret. Instead, the reunion was emotionally cold. Joseph Rustin remained distant and detached. The emotional reconciliation Audrey hoped for never truly happened. Yet remarkably, she still forgave him. More than that, she financially supported him for the rest of his life. That detail says everything about Audrey Hepburn's character. She possessed an extraordinary ability to forgive people who hurt her deeply. Friends often described her kindness as almost impossible to understand. Even when others disappointed her repeatedly, she rarely responded with bitterness. Still, forgiveness did not erase the pain. In later interviews, Audrey returned to the subject of her father again and again. Not angrily, but thoughtfully. Almost sadly. She seemed unable to stop wondering why he left, whether he ever loved her the way she loved him, and whether he understood how profoundly his absence shaped her life. That unresolved grief became one of the defining emotional realities of her existence. Ironically, the healthiest relationship of Audrey's life arrived much later, after Hollywood, after the divorces, and after much of her public career had already faded. In the late 1970s, she met Robert Wolders. Their relationship was completely different from the intense romances that had come before. There was no competition, no emotional manipulation, no constant drama. Wolders treated Audrey with gentleness and consistency. They settled together at her peaceful home in Switzerland, La Paisible. There, Audrey lived a surprisingly ordinary life. She gardened, cooked, walked through local markets, and avoided celebrity culture almost entirely. Neighbors often described her as humble and kind, nothing like the distant Hollywood icon people expected. For the first time, Audrey seemed genuinely calm. Wolders became her companion, confidant, and emotional anchor during the final years of her life. Though they never formally married, Audrey referred to him as her husband in private conversations because legal paperwork no longer mattered to her. What mattered was trust. At the same time, another purpose was beginning to define her life even more deeply than acting ever had. In the late 1980s, Audrey became a special ambassador for UNICEF. For many celebrities, humanitarian work becomes a side project attached to publicity. For Audrey, it became profoundly personal. She traveled to some of the poorest and most devastated regions in the world: Ethiopia, Sudan, Bangladesh, Somalia, and beyond. She met starving children, displaced families, and communities destroyed by war. The experiences affected her deeply because they reminded her of her own childhood during World War II. Audrey did not approach suffering as an outsider observing tragedy. She remembered being hungry herself. She remembered fear herself. She remembered what it felt like when humanitarian workers brought hope into devastated communities. People who traveled with her on these missions often said she connected with children instantly. They trusted her because her compassion felt real. It was real. In many ways, her humanitarian work became an attempt to give others the emotional safety she had spent her own life searching for. Then, in 1992, everything changed again. After returning from a trip to Somalia, Audrey began suffering severe abdominal pain. Doctors diagnosed her with a rare and aggressive cancer known as pseudomyxoma peritoneum. Surgery was attempted, but the disease had already spread too far. The diagnosis was terminal. Those close to Audrey later said she faced death with extraordinary calm. She worried less about herself than about leaving work unfinished. She wanted more time to help children, more time with her family, more time in the peaceful life she had finally built. Too weak to travel commercially, she was helped home to Switzerland through arrangements made by her longtime friend Hubert de Givenchy. Audrey spent her final Christmas surrounded by the people she loved most: her sons, Robert Wolders, and close friends. On January 20, 1993, Audrey Hepburn died peacefully at home in Switzerland at the age of 63. The world mourned a film legend. But those closest to her mourned something more intimate: an extraordinarily gentle human being who spent her life trying to transform personal pain into compassion for others. And in the end, when discussions turned toward love and heartbreak, Audrey's thoughts repeatedly returned not to husbands or lovers, but to her father. That was the man she never got over. Not because he was wonderful. Not because he deserved lifelong devotion. But because the loss happened too early and cut too deeply. Children rarely stop loving the parent who leaves them. Instead, they spend years trying to understand the absence. Audrey did exactly that for the rest of her life. Every relationship carried echoes of that first abandonment. Every search for stability carried echoes of the home she lost. Even her devotion to motherhood reflected her determination to give her own children the emotional security she never fully experienced herself. One of Audrey Hepburn's most famous later quotes was simple but revealing. She said, "The greatest thing you can give children is the feeling of being loved." For her, that statement was not philosophical. It was personal. Because despite the fame, the beauty, the awards, and the admiration of millions, Audrey Hepburn spent much of her life longing for the one thing every child deserves naturally: the certainty that someone will stay. And perhaps that is why people still connect to her decades after her death. Beneath the elegance and glamour was someone profoundly human. Someone wounded but compassionate. Someone fragile yet resilient. Someone who transformed pain into kindness instead of bitterness. That may be Audrey Hepburn's real legacy, not the dresses, not the films, and not even the fame. It was her ability to remain gentle in a world that repeatedly gave her reasons not to be.